So why don't we go ahead and get started. We're increasing my volume. Apparently I'm too quiet. So we are going to talk about partnering with non-Drupal designers. Who among us do we consider ourselves designers? Anyone? A few of us? Okay. Who among us do we identify more as being a developer? Yeah, a lot more of those. How about project managers? Other? Yeah? Well represented? Good. So I'm going to start off with a question for you guys. So how many of you does this scenario sound familiar? You're working on a Drupal project and the deliverable from your designer is a Photoshop mockup, right? That's pretty much how a lot of us still do things. So you're given this beautiful mockup. This mockup has been properly vetted all the way up the line from it's approved by the project owners all the way up to, let's say, your chief marketing officer. Everyone loves this Photoshop mockup. It's great. It's maybe been sort of hashed over and over again, like tweaked within like an inch of its life. Like, okay, we got this Photoshop mockup. This is perfect. Now it's going to be handed off to the developer. Here you go, developer. Build out this site in Drupal. So the developer goes in. They start building out their theme. They build out their little navigation thing on the side. It looks an accordion. It's a slideshow. They're pretty proud of it. They worked really, really hard. During their first demo with the product owner or the customer, they take a look at it. It's built out in HTML, or like in Drupal, it's been themed. And they say, well, wait a minute. This slideshow, when I shrink it down on mobile and I view it on my phone, those things, they're not swipeable. They're just clicked. We want it to be swiped. And the developer, you think, oh, we didn't really plan on that. But that's fine. We can extend the project timeline. We can make those things be swipeable. It'll cost more. Customer, not so happy with that, right? Let's say also this like accordion menu thing on the side. You build it out, and it turns out once you get actual content in there, our little our navigation menu items, they're not short like that. They're actually pretty long. They span multiple lines, and it's all wonky and it's off. And the customer says, "This isn't what we asked for." Developer says, "Well, we built it out. That's how it is." Yeah, not good, right? Does anyone face those types of scenarios? Yeah, I think many of us have. All right, how about this one? Whoops. How about this one? This time, you're a developer, and here your deliverable from your design agency is a lot of flat files. You get some HTML, CSS, JavaScript. This code has been properly accessibility checked. It's super performant. The design agency, they're really, really, really proud of this code. It's using like the latest, greatest version of jQuery. It's all like HTML5. It's awesome. So then the design agency, they hand this over to the Drupal developer. Here you go. Your job's 95% done. All you have to do, put in your Drupal tags, you'll be fine. But that's not normally how it works, right? With Drupal, we know we build out Drupal sites. That's not how it goes. So Drupal developer, you're kind of stuck. You're like, well, if you're on a really, really tight timeline, you're like, well, in time for launch, fine, I'll take your HTML code, I'll just put it in html.tpl.php, I'll kind of put in some PHP tags. I'm like, it's not great, but we got to make this deadline, so fine, we'll do it. We feel kind of dirty about it, but okay. So you could take that approach, but then later on, you didn't build it according to Drupal best practices. It's really, really hard to extend that code. It's just duct tape on top of duct tape. You want to build in new features later, more duct tape. Or you might take the approach of like, look, we're not just going to take your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code and use it as is. Drupal doesn't work that way. We need to slice and dice these into the Drupal templates. So that is going to extend the project timeline dramatically. It's going to take longer, and it's going to be more money. And then the customer is, they're not happy. They're like, well, we spent all this money working with this really, really expensive design agency. We budgeted this much to development, and it needs to get done. And expectations were not met. There are poor feelings. Has anyone had this happen before? Yeah, some of us? Okay. So how can we improve this process? So we developers, we need to learn to collaborate with designers more and not use the normal sort of waterfall workflow of, okay, now we're in design phase and we hammer out our designs and okay, developers, here you go, your job. We need to work more iteratively and we need to be more collaborative and treat our designer friends as our colleagues, not others. I know I come from more of a development background, and occasionally I find myself sort of thinking of designers as others, and we all need to get along, right? We also need to work on setting customer expectations around pixel-perfect designs, right? So I've worked with a lot of outside design agencies as part of my current job and also previous positions, and very often design agencies who are not that familiar with Drupal, they tend to use the argument of, well, our code is platform agnostic. You can use this code with any CMS. You just put your template tags in there, it'll be fine. And with a lot of other CMSs, that is how you do things, but not so much with Drupal. I've also heard the argument of, we shouldn't be constrained by our CMS. We are a creative agency. Design is meant to be free. We don't want to be just like shoeboxed into a CMS. I've also heard, but Christina, I thought Drupal could do anything. Drupal's really flexible, right? So, thing is, design agencies, if your customers have decided to use Drupal, they kind of are constrained. If they're decided to use Drupal and they have a budget and they have a timeline, they're constrained. If they do not have a timeline or a budget, sure, Drupal can do anything, right? So I'll tell you a little bit about me. I work at Acquia. I am a technical account manager. And so what that means is I am an advisor to some of our most elite customers. I have 6 customers who I am dedicated just to them. I help them with Drupal best practices, building out Drupal sites, digital strategy in general, and also serving as their advocate if they partner with other outside development or design agencies. So, so I've been a developer for professionally for about 15 years now. I've been doing Drupal for about half that time. And this has actually been sort of working with designers has been one of the biggest challenges that I've had over the course of my career. All right, step 1. How can we alleviate developer strife, and how can we set realistic expectations with our customers and our project owners? So first, we have to establish priorities. Normally, when building out Drupal sites, it's a balance between customization and maintainability in the long run. Usually, if you want a very, very custom design, very, very custom code, it's going to be a lot harder to maintain. It's going to be a lot longer to develop. So you have to work with your stakeholders on what are they willing to make compromises on. For some of them, maintainability might be their top priority. They might be willing to accept a design that is maybe based off of a front-end framework. It's not totally unique. It might be based off of Bootstrap or Foundation or something like that, and that's easier for their developers to maintain in the long run. On the other hand, maybe the customer is they're in the creative field of some sort, and they really want a very, very custom design, and it just won't fly to have something that looks like a lot of other websites out there. So you really have to work with the customers to gauge where sort of in that continuum they fall. Let's see. We also have to think of the initial launch versus long-term maintenance. A lot of my customers who I work with, they tend to focus a lot on, okay, we have this launch, we have to make this launch. Are our developers adequately resourced for this launch? And a lot of my customers who work with outside development shops, sometimes they don't really think of the long term of, okay, we built out this Drupal site, it's great, but what about the long term? As we all know, Drupal sites tend to be living, breathing organisms, and as soon as your developer's off the project, someone has to manage that site for the long haul. And if you have very, very custom code, a very complicated site, it's going to be really hard to do that if you are not adequately resourced. So yeah, so what are they willing to compromise on? It's also really, really good to get this in writing. I feel in the early parts of projects, people are like, oh yeah, no, we got it. Maintainability, yep, that's really important for us. But then as the project progresses, maybe there's some turnover and the people who made those initial decisions might not be around anymore, or things might get just sort of swept under the carpet and they forget. So if you get this in writing that like, yes, a big priority for us is maintainability. Or we are willing to extend the timeline and have this very, very custom, vaguely special snowflakey kind of site. So yeah, so establishing priorities. All right, so the next step that I think really helps is working iteratively with designers. So we'll talk about this sort of throughout this presentation in more detail, but it's still really, really, really common. Common workflow is that design gets done initially. Developers are brought in later. If they're aware of the project, they might be told, no, 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 don't worry. You'll get to do your part later. Sit tight for now. Working on design now. Occasionally also, design is done by a group that is completely separate from the developers. Design might be done very, very early on in the project, and the deliverable from the design agency is either these coded designs or the Photoshop files, and the customer comes to the developer and says, oh, hey, we have these designs. We worked with this awesome enterprising agency. They did these designs for us. Here's these mock-ups. Here you go. Build it out, developer. And at that point, the customer is really excited about their very fancy designs, and the developer kind of has to like pigeonhole it into Drupal and make it work. But if you are able to get in there early and work with the designers, you can work iteratively, and if you run into challenges that maybe were not initially spec'd out earlier in the project, you can roll with it and change course if need be. It's a lot easier to do that than in these situations where people get really, really excited about their awesome design, and they're not so happy about changing it, and they're not really crazy about a developer who's like, well, can't really do it like that. Kind of, you know, that sometimes doesn't go over so well either. So, right. So I feel like in both the design world and the development world, we all talk a big game about working iteratively. So why not work designers and developers work iteratively together? So yeah, so we talked about getting the developers in early in the project if you can. Sometimes this isn't possible. In the case where design was already decided at the outset and developers come in later. But if you can get your developers or someone who knows Drupal into the design process earlier, that's really, really, really important. Also with customers, if we talked earlier about setting up your priorities, if ease of maintenance is a priority and you decide to use a base theme, everyone here knows about base themes in Drupal, right? Base themes, subthemes, yeah. So you decide, you know what? For us, it's really important to us to have a site that's easy to maintain. We're going to use Bootstrap base theme. You're like, fine. So in those situations, if you're working iteratively with your designer, you can tell them, look, we want to use Bootstrap base theme. Please work off of that. They say, okay. Yeah, I have one customer now who they're familiar with Foundation. They really, really like Foundation, and they're working with an outside designer. And the outside designer says, well, we use Bootstrap. And my customer is like, well, we prefer to use Foundation, so please use that instead. And they said, okay. And a lot easier to do that earlier in the process than later on if this design agency had built out their templates using Bootstrap, and then later on my customers are like, well, now we kind of got to move this into Foundation, and people got really excited about these Bootstrap designs. And so they were lucky enough that they were involved early, and they were able to guide the designers in that sense and ask them to accommodate their preferred front-end framework. What's also good is if you get your developers in there early and you can start building out the site earlier, is you can start putting in your content. I know sort of the traditional workflow is like, okay, first we work on design, then we build out development, then the site's all built out, now we put our content in. But if you do each of these steps earlier in the process, then when you reach obstacles or challenges, you can work around them more easily. So you might realize once you start putting in real content into a site that maybe things that looked really, really good in your awesome Photoshop mockup might not look so great in real life. So here, oh, we have a title, we have a little image, we have a little blurb, oh, isn't this great? But in real life, it turns out the stuff that goes in this space is much longer. And so now it's all like not good looking. And so if we built out our site earlier, we realize, oh, the stuff that goes here, it's a lot longer than what we initially spec'd out for this space. So maybe we're going to have to tweak the design a little bit to accommodate text that's this length, right? If people had this whole situation, then you have to like deal with it, and it's like a big pain. Yeah. Okay. So we talked about start building out as soon as possible. So why should you do this? Normally, and traditionally, we wait for our coded designs and our Photoshop mockups, and all of our visual design worked out before we start building out this site. So what's wrong with this? Has anyone run into challenges with the pixel perfect design? Your Photoshop mockup looks great, and then you build out your site, and things kind of they don't quite line up, or they look great on the like 1200 pixel width Photoshop mockup, but once you get into real life and you have screens that are wider or narrower or on mobile, and it's all kind of off, and your content's longer than you planned, and it's not great. And so then, I know I've had this happen before where we build out the site, the customer, it looks kind of not great because their content's longer, and the customer is like, oh, but why doesn't this look like our wonderful design? And you say like, well, yeah, but your wonderful design didn't have real content in there. It had placeholder text. And once we got real content in there, it turns out this is much longer. And they kind of think about it, and they're like, but what about our design? And I'm like, oh, no. And so, yeah, so if, yeah, this strike a chord with folks. So yeah, so if you get content in there sooner, people don't get fixated on their pixel perfect design. And you can see, oh, our stuff's actually much longer. So so when in the process should you build out or start building out your site? I would say right after wireframes are finalized. So you have your wireframes, you have your what then will be turned into either like block regions or panels, layouts, or paragraph bundles, and start putting content in there. Even if you just have your like default, like if you have like Stark or something, Stark theme, just put your content in there. If you have your block region set, you can start building out your theme and just put stuff in there. Start building out your content types and your views once you have that content settled. And at this point, you probably don't have your color schemes and your fonts and whatever all nailed down, because presumably your design team is also working on those assets. Like they're working with their style tiles or whatnot. So that can go on concurrently to building out the site and building out content. So as soon as you have your wireframes signed off on, go for it, get in there, put in your content. Right? Okay. So we talked earlier about using real content. I know very often we all love our lorem ipsum text. And the thing that we don't really realize, or that's not immediately apparent, is that placeholder text is intended to fit the design. So let's say this title is kind of extending too long. I could just knock off the dol or a sit on the end, and like no one would know the difference. Like you can't really do that in real life. You can't just be like, well, okay, I'm going to kind of knock off this so I only have, but in real life, these titles. Like, it doesn't work. So, yeah, so try to use real content as soon as possible. So no lorem ipsum, other than in the like very, very, very early stages of your design. Does everyone still use lorem ipsum? Do we all still do lorem ipsum? No? How many of us use real content really, really early? Yay, good job, guys. Okay, so this also goes for images. I worked on a project in a previous job where we worked with an outside designer, and it was a beautiful design, but it had these very, very, very landscapey oriented images throughout the site, like they were everywhere. And it was really cool looking. And so for all of the early phases of the process, when everyone looked over these Photoshop mockups and these coded designs, these very, very horizontally oriented images, and they looked great. So we finally built out the site, and I get a call from one of the people from the team who managed this site, and they were like, look, Christina, I'm going to need the functionality to embed portrait style images in this spot. And I was like, but we don't have a layout for that because we just have these horizontal oriented images everywhere. And they were like, yeah, but we really don't have horizontally oriented images that we use for the content in that spot. We pretty much only have portrait style photos. And we're like, So we ended up building out another template that was the same general look and feel as the what was initially spec'd out, but it accommodated portraits. And then the customer was not happy because they liked the original first design with the horizontal images better. And they're like, well, why can't you make it like that? And we're like, that's horizontal, vertical. And of course, there's technical ways that you can get around this. Like we use image styles to like crop them a certain way, but that's not great because that's a technical solution when what you really need here is an editorial solution. You can't just like chop off tops of people's heads to make it like fit the spot. Oh, it'll be very edgy and that might be your thing. Maybe not. So, right. So I feel in a perfect world, you can curate what these images are that go in. In fact, when we had this whole thing with in that job with the horizontally oriented images as opposed to the vertical ones, I asked the team, like, well, why don't you go out and just take horizontal photos? Like, why do you just take all these vertical photos? They're like, well, we don't do these photos ourselves. We get these from other groups that give these photos to us. So they're already cropped to their most desirable proportions. So like, we don't have control over generating horizontal images like that. So we also talked earlier about setting expectations. Very often these designs, Photoshop designs, are signed off on by all the higher-ups and the powers that be very early on. And then as a developer, then you're kind of semi-obligated to build out this thing that was signed off on. So what I would, if at all possible, I would encourage you to, anything that needs to be signed off on, don't do it until you have your real content in there. Because then you're less stuck. I mean, sometimes that's not possible, but maybe you have multiple phases of signing off. Like you have like a preliminary sign off, but later on there's sort of a final sign off that is when you have your actual content in there, because things can change a lot, and we need to be nimble. Okay. So, right. So you also have to consider real life workflows. So, for example, if you are building a website and let's say the designer specs out a layout that has a very prominently displayed recent news block that displays title of news story and date. But it turns out your most recent news story is from 4 months ago. It looks really, really obvious that your site's out of date. And they think like, okay, your last news story was 4 months ago. What else on your site is out of date? And so you need to consider like, okay, do we have people who are generating this recent news? Like, are we adequately resourced staffing-wise to do that? Or do we just like the idea of recent news, but we don't really have the workflows to support that? In those situations, it might be better. Maybe you want to have a news section, and that's fine, but maybe you kind of bury it further in your site, or you don't display the dates next to the title, so it is not immediately obvious that your last recent news was 4 months ago. Something else to consider. I know, how many of us use panels for websites? Panels, We think, oh, this is great. We can allow the content editors to move their stuff around and create their own layouts. Great. But is that a workflow that your content editors are really actually in real life going to do? Maybe you don't want them to move their stuff around. Maybe you want it to be more locked down. And if that's the case, don't build out panels. I have one customer who I'm working with now, and they're redesigning their existing site. And in the last version of this site, they thought it would be a really great idea to there's so much flexibility. Our content editors, they have a pretty good eye for design. We're going to give them the ability to create their own panels layouts. And so now, this is now 4 years later that they're doing this redesign, and they have pages that look wildly different from each other. People get really, really confused by panels because managing this Drupal site is only like a small portion of their job, and every time they go in, they get kind of wigged out about how to use panels. So now in this version of the redesign, we're scaling back, and we are sort of over time going to sort of lock down designs a bit more so that content editors do not have as much flexibility with managing their layouts. So something else to consider is, how do site editors really actually work in real life? In a previous job, I worked for a university, and I was the in-house developer there, and we had this sort of it's a faculty directory. A lot of universities have these, where it's sort of this database of activities of what faculty members are doing. It lists like their research and their education, and a lot of things like that, sort of like a CV, but online. So this was like they sort of maintain a single page profile. So all the faculty members could log in, they manage their single page profile, has a bunch of photos, all sorts of stuff. So in the original design, we were very, very conscious about using simple language and writing for the web. And so in this original design, so at the very top of the page, there was supposed to be this little intro paragraph, and it was supposed to be just a single paragraph. And in this, the faculty members were supposed to say, in plain language, I studied the migratory patterns of the American pigeon, or whatever. But anyone who has ever worked for a university probably realizes that college professors are anything but succinct. They don't really boil their stuff down to single paragraphs. Instead, their paragraphs are more like, since my postdoc fellowship in 1982, I study the migratory patterns of the Pigeonus americanus, blah, 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 blah. And so when we built out this design, instead of this like nice, like short, succinct little thing, this intro text would be like way, way, way down the page. And it was this kind of grid layout, so it would like push other stuff down. And it was just bad news. And so for a while, we tried a bunch of user education initiatives, and we offered like writing for the web type classes. And some of the professors kind of got it, but some really, really, really didn't. Some were actually downright offended, and they were like, look, we are a world-class university. I'm not dumbing down my content. And so it ended up being sort of a losing battle. And so what we ended up doing was accommodating their workflow by, we ended up chopping off their extended blurb at the first paragraph. And so let's see, this thing, you can sort of imagine it's actually much longer. So we chopped it off at the first paragraph, do a show more link, and we just did a jQuery like show hide thing. So you get your short little succinct paragraph at first, show more, and like then you get their full oeuvre of work. So it satisfies everyone. It's short, but you can get more on demand. So, and also luckily we were able to sort of retrofit this after the fact. Ideally, we would have gotten our real content in there sooner, and that's when we would have seen that nobody writes short little things. They are pretty much all these like epically long paragraphs. So, okay, something else to really, really consider with building out Drupal sites from these mockups is really mapping out where our content is coming from. So we get these Photoshop mockups or coded design, and we see like, oh yeah, I got my list of recent news there. Oh yeah, I got my little slideshow. Like, okay, but where's this stuff coming from? Am I going in and manually editing this block, or is this pulling from a view? These slideshow slides, where are these coming from? Is there a special content type for like slideshow slide? Are these generated by clicking the like make sticky checkbox thingy on the content type? Or are these maybe pulling from some external resource and they're just showing up there? So you can also, if you sort of map this out very, very explicitly and talk about where these elements are coming from, that is a good way to get everyone on the same page. Because I have one customer now I'm working with where they have a slideshow type thing, and we kind of went around over and over and over again about whether or not a slideshow slide would be its own content type or whether it would be part of a larger content type that are the things that are just, make sticky at top of list or promote to homepage or whatnot. And there are pros and cons of each. We finally figured it out, but people had very, very strong opinions on one way or the other. And so, so what you can do to sort of map this out is if you have the actual Photoshop mockups, or maybe if these things are coded designs, like literally just print them out, mark them up with a pen, and be like, this is a view, this is a, pulled from this like external API. Okay, so earlier we talked about our priorities, about ease of maintenance, or the balance between ease of maintenance and custom code. So if ease of maintenance is a priority, you should consider using a base theme. A lot of these are some really popular ones. They have all sorts of like niceties built in, like, oh, it's automatically responsive. Oh, it's HTML5, or whatnot. So usually, if you're going to use a base theme, you are probably not building out very, very custom code. I mean, this is sort of a gross generalization, but I found that if you have very, very custom code or design or very, very specific JavaScript or responsive actions that you want to happen, sometimes base themes, they come with their own. And so if the whole point is to make your job easier, you probably want to go along with whatever the base theme is doing on its own for those. And of course, this is like a gray area. There's kind of there's a continuum here. So and earlier we also talked about getting involved with the designers very, very early on. And so this is the kind of situation where if you really like using Omega, for example, you can show this to your designer and say, look, here's the base theme we want to use. Please base your design off of that. Okay. Or don't use a contributed base theme. So earlier when we were talking about if ease of maintenance is your priority, base theme is probably the way to go. But if it's really, really important to have this code, this site that looks very different from a lot of other sites out there, you're probably going to have to write your own custom code anyway. And using a base theme can actually make this process a bit harder. On Drupal.org, or groups.drupal.org, there's sort of this perennial question about what's your favorite base theme? And people weigh in about, I like Zen, I like Omega, blah, blah, blah. And I'm always kind of left with like, I don't really have a favorite. In fact, most of the sites I've done, in the past, I've usually worked on teams that were very, very design focused, and a priority for them was having these very, very custom designs. And a few times I tried to use a base theme, like, well, this thing we're trying to build out, it looks and works pretty similar to Foundation, so maybe I'll just start with that and then like kind of work on and to work in the customizations off of that and do overrides. But then I found myself basically doing overrides of overrides, and that was super frustrating. So I ended up usually in those situations just like scrapping a base theme and doing it all from scratch. I know one of the big sticking points of like default Drupal output is like, oh, it's not HTML5. Oh, the divitis. Everyone knows about divitis, right? Do we all know about divitis? Yeah. I'm like, oh, this is terrible. So there are modules that can help with that to make HTML5 code or to sort of minimize the amount of divs that are all nested inside of each other. But my normal process when I was theming was just to start with like Stark theme that like comes like Drupal core and Drupal 7, and copy Stark, and then just kind of go off of there and do my own thing. So, or you can create your own base theme. So usually when we talk in terms of building out a site with a theme, we sort of refer to the theme of the site. But depending on how big the web presence is for the organization that you're working with, maybe you build multiple themes and multiple layers of themes. I think a lot of times people don't really realize that base themes and sub-themes, so we know that they inherit, but they're not just one level deep. They can go really, really, really deep. And so one of my university customers who I'm working with right now, so they're using Foundation as their like actual base theme. And then they have their university base theme, which is sort of below that. And then they have academic departments that are all pretty similar, but I think there's going to be some slight variation in colors between some of these. And so then they created a third/fourth layer of themes where by the time you get to this level, it pretty much only consists of like a .info file and a CSS file, and that's basically it. And initially we thought about building something into the like the academic department theme, for example, where a setting, like a colors setting, where you might define your color scheme there, but we found that like if you set a variable for like color one wasn't always used in the same place. That's why we ended up just like making a whole separate other layer of themes. And so this is sort of allowing them to give each site its own individuality while also keeping some of those common elements defined at a central level. And so something else, so this, normally you would do this if you have like a multi-site configuration, for example, but even if you have like one big site, like one of my customers has a very large organic groups setup. Everyone familiar with organic groups? Yeah. So they have very large OG setup, but they wanted separate themes for each OG. And so there's a module called theme key that sort of takes various contextual elements, and you can specify different themes for each. So where is that? So so we talked earlier about when you have design deliverables that consist of coded templates, normally you don't want to, or it's very, very difficult to replicate the exact code. You usually have a lot of overrides, a lot of preprocess functions, a lot of templates, and it can be surprisingly hard to replicate that exact code. Unfortunately, usually these coded templates are your design deliverable from the designer. So particularly in these cases where you're the developer who's brought in later, and these designs and coded templates are already set. So this is basically an exercise in managing expectations with your project owner here. Don't commit to reproducing the exact code if you can help it. I've been in situations where the code that was provided by an outside design agency had been already like accessibility vetted, and we kind of were quasi-obligated to replicate it, and it was a really tough job. So if at all possible, don't get wedded to the exact code, but instead use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code as a model, sort of like a working wireframe. So you can say, earlier we talked about with like a slideshow, for example, if the customer was expecting that the slides would be like swipeable on mobile, but developers hadn't really built it that way, using code deliverables as a model for that, and you're like, oh yeah, I see, this thing's supposed to be swipeable. But instead of replicating the actual code, try to find a more Drupal friendly or Drupal easier way to implement it. For example, like with slideshows, which I feel like everyone knows that slideshows are bad. Like all these usability studies are like, no one looks past the first slide, but like, let's face it, tons of sites still have slideshows all over them. And usually custom code has or custom code deliverables, they have like their own proprietary code for generating this slideshow, or at least if it's not proprietary, it's at least custom. So, okay, so you either overwrite a bunch of templates to get this code to work exactly the way it is, or if it were me, I would just use the view slideshow module and call it a day. Like, that's a lot easier, right? So something else I've noticed about working with design agencies is sometimes they don't really realize that Drupal outputs its own markup. Or else they hear bad things like, well, Drupal code is messy by default, which I suppose for front-end purists, yes, it is. And there are modules that, I mentioned earlier, there are modules that can help with that, like fences module, or things like semantic panels, semantic views, that kind of cleans up some of that code. And it's funny because I'm working with one customer now who they're doing their development in-house, but they're fairly new to Drupal, and they've been somewhat skeptical of sort of the Drupal-friendly ways of structuring their page templates and like the Drupal-friendly ways of embedding or calling their CSS files and their JavaScript files. And the argument is, well, we don't want to use PHP to include these because we don't want that performance overhead. I'm like, So as a result, they can't aggregate their JavaScript or their CSS. And they're just sort of calling external JavaScript resources like with the script tag. And so, so we ended up doing a speed test for that. I'm like, okay, let's see how fast your pages are loading with your like kind of not totally Drupal correct way. And then we sort of redid it. Well, they redid it. I told them how to do it. And the more Drupal correct way with using like their Drupal add.js to embed their JavaScript. And this time they were able to aggregate their JavaScript and their CSS. And they made a whole bunch of other sort of more Drupal-friendly improvements. And their pages loaded a lot faster. And so that was pretty exciting. And also using the more Drupal correct way of embedding these external resources, in addition to being more performant, it was also easier to extend their code later. So, yep. So also, JavaScript in Drupal. Who here has gotten JavaScript from an outside designer? You try to embed like third-party JavaScript into a Drupal site, and you have to jump through a lot of hoops, right? Have people done? Yeah, it's not easy. So one of my customers now, who they are working with an outside design agency who's supplying HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And in a call the other day, the design agency was going through this demo of all of their JavaScript and all of these like very, very proprietary JavaScript libraries and sort of products that they were using. And so finally we kind of interrupted. We were like, look, this is a Drupal site, so we're not going to be using your JavaScript just as it is. We're going to have to kind of slice and dice it to make sure that it doesn't conflict with other JavaScript in the site. And this design partner, they were a little surprised by that. And they were like, but our JavaScript is all bundled together. Like, we know it doesn't conflict with each other because we've tested it. And we were like, yeah, but it's going to be other JavaScript in there too. Like, Drupal outputs its own JavaScript and JavaScript from modules. And so we need to sort of structure it in a way that things will play nicely together. So something else also is that a lot of design agencies, they of course like to use the latest, greatest version of jQuery, which, as hopefully we all know, in Drupal is several versions, or Drupal is, the jQuery that comes packaged with Drupal is several versions behind whatever the most current version of jQuery is, right? And so I've seen a lot of people just put a link to the JavaScript library in their html.tpl.php and reference it that way, which is bad because Drupal is already referencing jQuery itself. So instead, we of course have to use jQuery update module. Everyone knows about jQuery update module, yeah. We also have to wrap our. Oh, I have to wrap up soon. We also have to wrap up our wrap our JavaScript in Drupal behaviors. Does everyone know about Drupal behaviors and theming? Yeah. Okay. actually, we are kind of wrapping up here too. So, okay, so finally, any sort of code scans or site audits that get done, I feel usually a lot of work is done, particularly when we get coded designs from outside vendors. A lot of time is spent scanning and auditing like that code deliverable, but it's also really, really important to run those code scans on the finished Drupal site. Because since Drupal outputs its own markup also, it's kind of apples to oranges comparing your initial design deliverable, coded design deliverable with what Drupal wants to output. And finally, don't forget about accessibility. This is something I found working with a lot of design agencies. Is very, like, now everyone knows, like, it's the right, I mean, in some cases you're legally obligated to build accessible websites, but it's also just the right thing to do. And so people are cognizant of this. And so sometimes when interviewing a design agency, we ask them like, oh, and is your code accessible? And of course, they say yes, because who is going to say no? I hadn't actually thought about that. They say, oh, yeah, no, of course our code is accessible. But what does that really actually mean? So there's Section 508 compliance. There's also the WCAG, which has the different levels of like A through AAA of accessibleness. And depending on if you're a government organization, for example, you have like fairly high standards of accessibility they have to pertain to. It also goes for public universities, K through 12 schools, and federally funded nonprofits. And so you might want to quiz these design agencies if you are using their code as is, or closely adhering it to what extent are they accessible? Like, what accessibility measures do they take? Because we all know about alt tags, we all know about screen readers, but accessibility also comprises other things that we don't sometimes think immediately of, like color contrast. Some things, people who are colorblind can't really tell the difference in colors, so you don't want color to be your only delineation for certain elements. Also language, we don't want our language to be too difficult to understand. We want to use simple language, and that actually also falls under accessibility. So yeah, I just included a couple of resources there of, these are scanners to see sort of how your site fares accessibility-wise. And yeah, that is it.